people have been following the Occupy movement? How many people were watching some of the live streams from the different Occupy actions? Following it on Twitter? How many people were looking to places like CNN to get the most up-to-the-minute news on Occupy? Okay, we can go home now. In some ways I feel like we don't fit at a session like this because we're not about empowering pipes, but we very much fit because we're very much about the same spirit of freedom and equity. And once you have all those fat pipes and that wireless broadband, what do you put on them? So Kwan and I are co-founders of a local community site called Oakland Local. And Susie's an independent journalist who thought she was going to spend 2 weeks covering Occupy and ended up spending 7 months. The thing that you have to know is that unlike a lot of the projects that you guys are working on, which I've been very envious about, we don't have any large foundation funding. Most of the money that we've gotten has been crowdfunded, money that we've gotten through tip jars and through appeals. So if you're looking to people like us, who are really very much at the center of Occupy Oakland and really owning accurate, independent coverage of what was happening in the Occupy movement in the Oakland area, when you think about that, it's another freedom issue. Because if you don't support a free press, how can it survive? So we're going to talk a little bit today, but first I thought maybe we could just look at a couple of slides really quickly and show some work. So, these are kind of the questions that we want to talk about, but I want you to just get a feeling for who people are. So if we could just go to the next slide. One more. So I want Kwan just to talk a little bit about who he is and kind of how you got here and the role you played in really putting Oakland Local in the middle of Occupy. And Oakland Local, just for those of you who haven't seen it, is both a news site and a community coverage site, but we distribute to Yahoo News. We work with Mother Jones. We work with the Media Consortium, New American Media. So we syndicate our content all over the country. Over to you, man.
Can everyone hear me okay? Hello? Hello? All right, we have sound. Well, first, I kind of like the indescribable description because that really embodies what I've been doing the last few years in media and what Oakland Local has evolved into over the last 3 years. Little background really quick. I started in community media about 10 years ago. I was the editor of a local nonprofit community African-American site in Oakland, California. We had an open door policy literally 24 hours a day. People could walk in off the street, pitch stories, talk directly to me or the publisher. And that really informed the next 6 years of how I approach media. From the community newspaper, I did startup work with a lot of Silicon Valley technology companies, did freelancing for a lot of small and large mainstream media publications. And when we started Oakland Local, Susan and I both had, in some ways, the benefit of not being burdened by mainstream media culture. We were community activists, we were professional organizers, we had done a lot of roles, but we had never been burdened by we're the mainstream media, what we says goes. So that has its benefits and its problems that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but as we approach Occupy Oakland and any of the other community coverage that we do, we really have that open door policy, come talk to us. We want to provide as many broad types of coverage and from different sectors as possible. So what we do is about 50% of our coverage is by professional journalists. These can be people who went to grad school. These can be people who actually came from some newsrooms that have been closed over the last couple of years. These can be people who just are looking to really jump into the next digital wave from traditional publishing. The other half are community activists, organizers, people who just want to get their word out but don't know the best way to do it. And having those two sides has given us the really broad and nuanced coverage. For example, one of the most popular Occupy pieces we did on the site was by an African-American male. He identifies as a feminist and an ally of the queer community. And when Occupy started about 3 weeks into it, he wrote a first-person plea asking for mainstream organizations, larger organizers, people who weren't of color, white folks primarily, to actually come in and provide a safe space for people of color and queer people in the movement. It went up at about 4 o'clock. By 6 o'clock, it was one of the most heavily trafficked pieces. Because this was an opinion that you might not have heard otherwise, I found the piece, to be perfectly honest, I found it on the Facebook status update. It turned into one of the most popular, most heavily discussed pieces. The next day, there was a response saying how the person disagreed with this article, and there was an incredibly robust debate that happened on our site, on Facebook, on social media. It wasn't a traditionally reported piece. None of these people involved had never been to J school. I found it literally by surfing on Facebook. But by harvesting those kinds of opinions, we've been able to bring a lot of people into the conversation that might not have been there before. Now, with that being said, we do have to make sure that we maintain our journalistic credibility. Even if the people who come to our site are journalists or just community members, they have to maintain a certain amount of respect, they have to maintain a certain amount of tact, and they have to be able to back up everything they're saying with facts and with valid opinions. And that's one of the challenges that we've been facing with Occupy and with all of our coverage. How do we be in the exact middle, where we're the voice of the community, we actually make sure that we provide a wide voice of opinions, because a lot of the times the people that we report on, they're our neighbors, they're the people that we go to church with, they're the people in our community gardening groups. And just as much as we get, the insider juicy tidbits, we also have to pay attention, because we're gonna see those people in our community. So how do you maintain that balance? But on the other side, as journalists, as professionals, we have the obligation to hold these people accountable. So what we've been doing is a really intricate dance that's, in my opinion, produced some really intelligent work and kind of stretching the ideas of what journalism can be. So I'll shut up right there. I'll pass it over to Susie, and we can take questions after.
So I'm going to let Susie tell her own story, but it's a remarkable one.
So when I started covering Occupy Oakland, I do some of my coverage in drawings. I also write articles, but I draw things. I draw real things. It's kind of not what people think of when they think of editorial cartooning. I don't draw silly elephants and donkeys fighting. I draw riot police in the actual riot gear that they wore. And so I was really seeking to create a lasting document about Occupy Oakland, and along the way I was using social media to kind of track little updates that otherwise I wouldn't have done much with, because I was not doing breaking news. But because of the nature of Occupy, social media kind of became a great source of actual breaking news. I became a breaking news reporter despite myself. And so I found myself in situations that a breaking news reporter would have found themselves in that I wasn't used to. I've been arrested twice while covering Occupy. In California, they don't recognize, if you work on the internet, they don't recognize you as a reporter. If you are freelance, they don't recognize you as a journalist. I was writing articles for The Atlantic and The Guardian UK, but it didn't matter. I wasn't a journalist. And on top of that, I was drawing, which, what the hell? Nobody understands that. And it just made me a weirdo. I don't have any answers. I don't know what.
Talk about how you got paid, because that's one of the issues we have here, is how do you sustain this kind of original work? So did you have big media who wanted to give you nice stipends to do these pieces?
I ended up getting paid far more by people this community that I inadvertently created, who were following what I essentially thought of as my notes that I was putting out as live updates on Twitter. Those people considered that their news, and they paid me. And that is how I sustained my coverage for a long period of time, far more with that crowdfunding than with the payments from places like The Atlantic and The Guardian, which is not something I ever considered. I had a traditional journalism background. I went to Columbia Journalism School, and this is kind of anathema to them. This is anathema to all of mainstream media. Mainstream media was making fun of me while I was in jail. They thought it was funny. They were glad that I was not out there anymore, because I was getting stories that they weren't. They follow me on Twitter, and they send out I know ABC7 sends out their vans according to what my updates are as to where the stories are. They say, oh, she's there, now we should go there.
Let's show Susie's next slide for a minute. So Susie, just go one more. Great, so these are some of the other photos, and what was the reaction of the occupiers to your work?
Mostly good. I mean, there's issues within the Occupy movement of anonymity that I struggle with in making a visual document and drawing real people doing real things. But what I think of I mean, the Occupy movement is an incredibly visual spectacle, which is why I was really drawn to not just write about it, but to draw about it. And I think that to me, that drawing journalism is kind of an access issue. I bring these stories to an audience who wouldn't necessarily want to read a long article, but they'll look at drawings that might tell them something that an article wouldn't. And I find that to be, I mean, something like this little infographic with the gun showing the less lethal ammunition. You could read an article describing that, or you could look at that graphic. That graphic is going to make that information accessible to people who might not otherwise want to read an article, who wouldn't care. But that's immediate in a different way.
Let's go to the next slide. So I'm the publisher of Oakland Local. And part of what I do is worry about how we're going to keep going. And I'm very proud of a lean business model we have where we work out of a co-working space. Most of our staff is part-time. We're like a movie crew that we pay per piece, even though it's a core of people. But the reality is we're really, really struggling to survive, even though we've won 4 journalism awards in the past 6 months, even though we have partnerships and we're on the radio all the time with places like KQED. And this is kind of about the gap between the disintermediation that we've talked about with traditional media and then the lag in a community like ours where people may not have grown up giving to public radio, who aren't necessarily used to donating themselves unless they have a issue like Occupy that kind of is a crisis they want covered. And I've done a lot of study of what the problems are, and I've discovered that one of the biggest problems for Oakland Local survival, in my opinion, is that unlike a lot of other sites like ours around the country, we have received no support from any of the local community or family foundations. So if you go to St. Louis, you go to New York, you see there are places like the New York Community Trust, Community Foundation in Boston. They've done a great job providing some underpinning of operating to a lot of other civic-minded nonprofit media. We don't have that, even though we're in the super progressive Bay. And it's not just that they're not funding us, it's that they're not funding anybody. The Bay has not crossed the bridge to think of this as something that they need to support. So, I come to a conference like this, and it's really interesting to me because we're talking about the future. And I think that we're talking about the future too, right? There are going to be more and more people trying to do what we're doing, both by choice and by necessity. If you look at the job market, you can see it. And yet, we're in this enormous gap. Susie needs to pay her rent. We need to sustain ourselves and our writers. Kwan and I both work other jobs to help pay for our time that we put into this, and we don't want that to continue. So, I think the question that I'm really interested in is, how do you have internet freedom at no expense? Because how do we get funded, right? What are the right models? And we sold $36,000 worth of ads last year, so it's not that we're waiting for a government handout, right? We're very scrappy and entrepreneurial, but I'm very interested in what I've come to see is a gap between the rhetoric that our society pays to valuing this kind of work highly, and yet, you know what? We get paid about as well as preschool teachers, and they're undervalued too. So I'd like to open it up to comments and questions from the audience. Love to hear other people's opinions. Love to know if you're supporting or you have nonprofit community media in your area that you're turning to. And I think we're all dreaming about that wireless broadband future where not only words but images and video can be right there on our portable discs. So comments, questions?
Well, I have a comment. I would I'd like to explain. We, in addition to these 3 talented individuals, we reached out to several of the live streamers. A guy named Tim Poole, who does a live stream called Timcast and covers mostly New York. And we reached out to Oak for Show.
Oak for Show, Spencer Williams.
Yes, who does a lot of the live streaming in Oakland. And I don't know if some of you did raise your hands, you've seen it. I can be riveted to that stuff for a couple of hours, watching what's going on there. The Trayvon Martin march in New York was truly must-see TV for me. And it really, this new journalism, I'm finding very compelling.
I want to make a quick point about that, which is the spirit of what David's talking about really goes away from just demonstrations into a level of openness and transparency. I put up a story in Oakland Local this morning. The Public Safety Committee in Oakland voted today because the city prosecutor, the city attorney, issued a memo that said, we should pass an ordinance in Oakland that no one can come to a demonstration in Oakland with any tools of violence. If you bring a tool of violence and you march in Oakland, we're going to throw the book at you. So I went and I read these articles and I was like, okay, that's pretty interesting. I also found it on Facebook first. But, you know, traditional media doesn't actually provide you with any access to source material. So I went and I got the ordinance and I read it. And, like, she doesn't want you to bring a paint can. She doesn't want you to bring a wrench. She doesn't want you to bring a stick. We're not talking like guns and knives here. It's like maybe you would smash a window. So, you know, tools of violence are a lot of the household implements, except for the shields. She's very upset about the shields. But, you know, we put the whole document up. We think that people in Oakland don't just want the media to tell them what it said. We think they want to read it themselves. And that's kind of the same spirit as the live casting. It's trying to give people as direct access to what really happens and to the tools of power as possible.
I think for me, I've been really interested in the last couple of years of the space that community activists inhabit. And in a lot of ways, unfortunately, we're kind of the perfect storm of unfundability. We've really been making this shit happen just by, you know, sweat and tears. So if you look at both of our organizations, for Oakland Local and Susie as an independent journalist, a lot of the stuff that we do, Susie through her drawings, Oakland Local through our community coverage, doesn't fit into the classification of traditional journalism. So as a result, people who are in traditional journalism might turn a blind eye. The communities that we cover, they're marginalized. A lot of them have been downtrodden in various ways. They're not used to seeing themselves reflected. And a lot of them, to be honest, they're from a lower socioeconomic class. So the funding isn't going to come from them. They love the work, they follow it. We can tell you numbers, you know, out the wazoo of how many people love our work, and we see it just when we walk down the street every day. But those aren't the people that are going to sustain an organization like ours or a journalist like Susie doing independent work. And from a community foundation side or from the larger funding side of it, we don't fit into, we're media, so they don't fund media. Or we're two communities, so we don't fund community. So looking at what the next step of media, what new journalism is going to look like in the upcoming years, we mentioned Spencer, Oak for Show, and all the other live streamers. We're looking at a really interesting place where we know how to make it work. We know how to make it effective. We know how to reach the communities that have been marginalized for so long, but what's that infrastructure going to look like? And that's the question I'm asking. That's the question hopefully we can talk about a little bit more today, and we're asking ourselves in our individual circles.
So we have 6.5 minutes. How about if we take a couple of questions? Why don't we start over here?
So, sort of on that note. Isaac Wilder. Hi. I also occupied. On the note of sort of making it work, I wonder if you could talk about how your relationship with your readers is mediated through certain corporate media channels like Facebook, and how you feel about that, and if there are things that you do to sort of counteract that, or how that factors in to your relationship with your audience. Thanks.
I'll do it. Well, just speaking for Oakland Local, we kind of run the gamut from extreme political organizers to really moderates. I don't think we have any Republicans on staff, but we have lots of knockdown, drag-out battles in our editorial meetings. And we're definitely aware of the fact that we're filtering things through Facebook, through Yahoo News, through even the San Francisco Chronicle. And partially the way we look at it is a necessary evil. Not to necessarily say that those organizations are evil, but we know they have corporate interests. But those are also where the people are. But then on the other side of that, we do a lot of facilitations either offline, in person, or through more private networks. And we are pretty conscious of making sure that the information gets distributed on all of those channels. Because as much as we love technology, as much as we love live tweeting and Facebook and social networking and all that, a lot of the folks that we focus on specifically, they don't have computers. So for us, it's both a question of being in corporate control and also understanding and knowing and being where our audiences are. So we have to play both sides of the fence because of that.
I've actually been really frustrated with that. I prefer not to use Facebook myself. I use Twitter a lot, but I work with independent news outlet Truthout pretty often, and they were supposed to set up a live blog for me, and they just couldn't figure out the infrastructure in time for some big event, and so I was forced to use Twitter, and it was really frustrating. I would have really liked to be able to have something just on their site, and we just couldn't do it.
Next question, Lev.
Hi, Lev Gonik from Cleveland, Case Western Reserve University. I just wanted to share with you that there is lots of symbiosis between obviously the work that you're doing and the work that those of us who are involved in both wire and wireline services, because we're both interested in the hyperlocal experience and trying to have an impact on the hyperlocal environment. And I share with you one small model that maybe we're thinking about, which is trying to create a business model that's about hard driving news-breaking activity has constraints, and you guys are living the dream. One of the other models that we've tried in Cleveland with the hyperlocal is actually a combination of what we think is hard-hitting enough, that is to say much more so than anything else in the mainstream media, along with what we call the Cool Cleveland section, which is all the interesting activities that are going on, whether they're poetry slams, music jams, events going on, slow food community, and on and on and on. And that material is actually now got enough traction that it's actually being sponsored. That is to say, people are paying for the placement of that activity, and it's paying salaries. In fact, Cool Cleveland is now celebrating its 5th year of completely self-sustained economic viability, which makes possible a lot of the other hyper-local stuff. So I share that as a kind of blended and hybrid model, and perhaps that's already stuff that you're already doing in Oakland Local. But
We're actually thinking really hard, so that's really helpful. What we've done in the past month is we've taken a pivot into covering tech. So we have a new column called Oak Tech. I spent 8 years in Silicon Valley working for big companies. Kwan also has a background working with tech, and we've been working really hard to bring tech companies to Oakland. And one day I woke up and said, wait, I was hanging out with Mike Arrington when he started TechCrunch. Why aren't we doing a better job chronicling what we're trying to trigger in Oakland? So I think one of the things we'll see is if tech, which has ties to, things that are a little harder from a business perspective, might be a better revenue source for us, as well as arts and culture.
I've found that particularly frustrating, that sort of dynamic of the arts and culture pays for the news, because I don't want to do the arts and culture. I want to do the news, and the news doesn't pay for the news. There's a reason why Neiman Lab called Oakland a news desert recently. We have so many stories that are just going ignored because there's no infrastructure for that.
Next question.
Hi, Levi Maya from Full Channel in Rhode Island. On our community portal site for high-speed internet customers, we have syndicated some patch content. Now, that's the closest thing we have in Bristol County, Rhode Island, to what you're doing, and I don't even know if I would call it similar to what you're doing. How do you distinguish yourself from what AOL is doing with patch and what Oakland Local is doing?
I love that question. You want to go first?
Yeah,
go ahead.
A couple of quick questions. We live and are active in the communities that we're a part of, and we don't have any money.
And we don't have a corporate mandate. Patch has a template, so there was a huge storm in the Bay when Patch said we're going to have a mother's corner. And a lot of dads said, a mother's corner? I'm home with my kid half-time, or I'm a dad who's working from home. Why is it a mother's corner? And they couldn't get corporate to change it. So I think, the difference is that we're both of the community, and we have the ability to customize ourselves to local community issues. And, we're not that giant pendulum swing of, we're going to spend $500 million and then we're going to You know, Patch had more cutbacks today. They've blended the South zone into the East Coast now. So that march toward oblivion is completely advancing.
I think one of the ways I look at it, and make this really quick, is we approach media more like as a startup model than a traditional media organization. We're a really small staff, 4 people paid, a couple of freelancers, and what Oakland Local looks like now has evolved a lot, and since the way we started 3 years ago. And I think being able to pivot that quickly, being able to respond to the needs of the community, really differentiates what we're doing and other hyperlocal or community media sites around the country from a lot of the larger, more templated sites. So, thanks.
Join me in thanking Susie, and Kwan. Thanks for coming all this distance. And share. Susie, were you going to show some cartoons?
Oh, I'll put them up later.
Put them up later, okay. In the break, maybe. Okay, and now a word. 1001, 1002. And now a word from our sponsors.